The notion that the Italian peninsula was the soft underbelly of Europe was a phrase that would come to haunt the men who waded ashore in the late summer of 1943. To the strategists in London and Washington, looking at maps spread across mahogany tables, the boot of Italy looked like a vulnerable, elongated appendage of the Axis powers, a place where a swift kick could knock the wind out of the German war machine. But maps do not show the smell of wet wool, the texture of deep, sucking mud, or the claustrophobic dread of a valley floor commanded by artillery dug into granite peaks thousands of feet above. The story of the campaign behind the mountains begins not with the mountains themselves, but with the sea and the heat. It was early September 1943. The Allies had already taken Sicily, a messy but successful operation that had shaken the Italian political foundation to its core. Benito Mussolini had been arrested, and the Italian government was in a state of chaotic transition, secretly negotiating an armistice with the Allies while ostensibly remaining loyal to their German partners. The Germans, however, were under no illusions. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, suspected the betrayal and had begun moving veteran divisions south, preparing to turn the peninsula into a fortress. When the invasion fleet for Operation Avalanche approached the Gulf of Salerno, south of Naples, the Mediterranean was calm. The soldiers of the United States Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark Clark and the British 10th Corps waited in the humid holds of the transport ships. The air was thick with the smell of diesel oil and nervous sweat. These men were a mix of veterans who had seen the deserts of North Africa and the hills of Sicily, and green troops for whom this would be the first taste of combat. They were told that the Italians were surrendering, that the landing might be a walkover. The loudspeakers on the ships announced the armistice just hours before the landing. Cheers erupted from the decks. Men unclasped their helmets and smiled, thinking the war here was over before it had begun. They were wrong. As the landing craft lowered their ramps onto the beaches of Paestum and Salerno in the pre-dawn darkness of September the 9th, the silence was shattered not by welcoming crowds, but by the tearing sound of German machine guns and the shrieking whistle of 88mm artillery shells. The Germans had not left. The 16th Panzer Division had taken up positions in the hills overlooking the crescent-shaped bay, and they were waiting. The geography of Salerno was a foreshadowing of the entire campaign. A narrow strip of beach gave way to a flat plain, which was immediately hemmed in by steep, craggy mountains. The Germans held the high ground. They always held the high ground. For the next week, the battle for the beachhead hung by a thread. The American 36th Infantry Division, the Texans, found themselves pinned down in the ancient Greek ruins of Paestum, fighting among the Doric columns of temples built 2,000 years prior. The contrast was stark, modern tanks maneuvering around limestone pillars that had stood since the time of the Caesars, while the sky was crisscrossed with tracers. The German counterattacks were ferocious. They drove a wedge between the American and British sectors, threatening to split the Allied force in two and throw them back into the sea. At one point, the situation was so dire that General Clark considered evacuating the American sector to reinforce the British. But the stubbornness of the infantry, the overwhelming power of naval gunfire from the battleships offshore, and the relentless sorties of the Allied air forces held the line. The ground shook continuously for 6 days. By the time the Germans began a tactical withdrawal on September the 16th, the beachhead was littered with the burning hulks of Mark IV tanks and shattered landing craft. The Allies had their foothold, but the cost had been steep, and the illusion of a soft underbelly had been buried in the sand of Salerno. With the beachhead secure, the drive north began. The objective was Naples, the great port city that was essential for supplying the Allied armies. But as the Germans pulled back, they introduced the Allies to a new kind of warfare, a strategy of delay and destruction that would define the next 2 years. This was not the blitzkrieg of Poland or France, where armies swept across vast open plains. This was a war of engineering and demolition. Kesselring knew he could not stop the Allies indefinitely, but he could make them pay for every mile. As the German rear guard retreated, they blew up every bridge, collapsed every tunnel, and mined every culvert. They felled trees across the roads and booby-trapped the debris. The American combat engineers and the British sappers became as important as the riflemen. They worked tirelessly, often under mortar fire, to bulldoze bypasses and lay Bailey bridges across ravines so the tanks and trucks could move forward. When the Allied troops finally entered Naples in early October, they found a city that had been methodically murdered. The harbor was a graveyard of scuttled ships, cranes toppled into the water, and docks blown into concrete jaggedness. The Germans had destroyed the water system and the electricity grid. But the malice went deeper. They had left behind time bombs. One such device, hidden in the basement of the Naples post office, detonated days after the liberation, killing dozens of civilians and soldiers and reducing the building to rubble. It was a psychological message. Even when we are gone, we can still kill you. The capture of Naples marked the end of the beginning. Now the map of Italy changed. North of Naples, the peninsula narrows and the Apennine Mountains, the rugged spine of Italy, spread out to dominate the landscape. The coastal plains vanish, replaced by a series of transverse river valleys and ridges that run roughly east to west, acting as natural defensive barriers against an army trying to move south to north. And then the weather turned. In Italy, when the autumn rains come, they do not simply wet the ground, they transform it. The volcanic soil of the region, when mixed with persistent rain, turns into a substance the soldiers called gumbo. It was a thick, adhesive mud that clung to boots in heavy globs, adding pounds to every step. It swallowed the wheels of jeeps and trucks. It sucked the boots off mules. The dry, dusty roads of summer became impassable quagmires. The rivers, which had been trickles in August, swelled into torrents. The first major obstacle in this new, wet phase of the war was the Volturno River. It was mid-October, 1943. The river was swollen with rain, the banks were steep and slick with mud, and the Germans were dug in on the far side. The crossing of the Volturno was a nightmare of logistics and endurance. Men had to drag assault boats through the mud, launch them into the swift current under machine gun fire, and then claw their way up the opposite bank. It was here that the American soldier, the GI, began to learn the rhythm of mountain warfare. It was a rhythm of waiting, climbing, and freezing. The standard issue equipment was often inadequate for the conditions. The leather combat boots were not waterproof, and trench foot became a major casualty producer. Men learned to massage their feet with whale oil and change their socks whenever possible, drying the wet pairs against their skin inside their jackets. The M1943 field jacket with its layered system had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers, so men wore everything they owned: wool sweaters, raincoats, scarves, trying to keep the damp chill from settling into their bones. As the Fifth Army on the west and the British Eighth Army on the east pushed slowly north from the Volturno, they encountered the German Winter Line, a complex series of fortifications anchored on the high peaks. The most formidable section was the Gustav Line, which ran across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula. At the heart of this line, blocking the entrance to the Liri Valley, the only viable route to Rome, stood the town of Cassino, and towering above it, the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. But before they could even reach Cassino, they had to fight through the outlying defenses, the Winter Line proper. This involved a series of brutal battles for mountain peaks that had no names, only elevation numbers on a map. Hill 575, 0.1103, Mount Camino, Mount Samucro. To take a hill in the Italian campaign followed a grim script. First, the artillery would pound the summit. The valleys would echo with the thunder of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. The air would fill with the acrid scent of cordite. Then the infantry would begin the ascent. They carried light loads, often leaving their heavy packs behind, taking only ammunition, grenades, water, and rations. The slopes were steep, covered in scrub brush and loose scree. One false step could send a shower of rocks clattering down, alerting the German sentries. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had established reverse slope positions. This meant they dug in on the side of the hill facing away from the Allied advance, protecting them from direct artillery fire. When the Allied bombardment stopped and the infantry crested the ridge, the Germans would emerge from their deep bunkers and open fire with MG-42 machine guns, the terrifying weapon known as Hitler's zipper because its high rate of fire sounded like tearing canvas. One of the most harrowing battles of this period took place at the village of San Pietro in Fine in December 1943. San Pietro guarded the entrance to the Liri Valley. It was a medieval stone village perched on the side of a mountain, terraced with olive groves. The 36th Texas Division was tasked with taking it. For days, they threw themselves against the German positions. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, taking place in the olive groves and among the stone walls of the terraces. The rain was relentless. The wounded could not be evacuated by jeep. The terrain was too rough. This brought about the return of an ancient beast of burden, the mule. The mule became the lifeline of the Allied armies in Italy. Italian muleteers, often wearing mismatched uniforms and caps, guided trains of mules up the narrow mountain trails, carrying ammunition and food to the men on the peaks and bringing the dead and wounded down. A mule could carry 200 pounds of supplies or 2 litters strapped to its flanks. They were stubborn, sure-footed, and prone to freezing under artillery fire, but without them, the campaign would have ground to a halt. The bond between the soldier and the mule became a strange, affectionate reality of the war. Men would share their rations with the animals, speaking to them in a mix of English and broken Italian. The battle for San Pietro was a microcosm of the campaign. By the time the village fell, it was a ruin. The stone houses were pulverized. The olive trees were splintered stumps. The 36th Division had suffered heavy casualties. And what was the reward for this victory? A view of the next mountain, the next ridge, the next line of German fortifications. As 1943 bled into 1944, the Allies found themselves staring at the true strength of the Gustav Line. The weather was now truly winter. Snow capped the peaks of the Apennines. In the foxholes, which were often little more than scrapes in the rocky ground filled with freezing water, life was miserable. Hot food was a rarity. The men lived on cold hash and hard biscuits. The constant damp caused uniforms to rot. Dysentery and jaundice were rampant. The psychological toll was immense. In other theaters of war, like the Pacific or later in France, there was often a sense of movement, of progress. In Italy, progress was measured in yards. A battalion might spend a week fighting to capture a single farmhouse, only to lose it the next night in a counterattack, and then take it again 2 days later. The constant exposure to artillery fire, particularly the German Nebelwerfer, a 6-barreled rocket launcher, frayed the nerves. The soldiers called the rockets screaming mimes because of the terrifying howl they made as they flew through the air. The sound was distinct and paralyzing, followed by a cluster of explosions that could wipe out a platoon. The Germans held the high ground at Monte Cassino with a tenacity that commanded a begrudging respect from the Allies. The monastery, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, sat like a crown on the mountain. It dominated the view for miles. From its walls, German observers could see every movement in the Liri Valley below. If a truck moved on Highway 6, the main road to Rome, artillery shells would rain down on it within minutes. The Allied soldiers felt naked, constantly watched by the unblinking stone eyes of the monastery. There was a debate raging in the Allied High Command about what to do with the monastery. It was a cultural treasure, a historic sanctuary. The Vatican had pleaded for its safety. The Germans claimed they were not using the building itself, but their defensive positions were dug into the slopes right up to the walls. To the grunts in the mud below, the monastery was not a historic site. It was the reason they were dying. It was the eye of the enemy. In January 1944, the decision was made to try and break the stalemate with a bold maneuver. A new amphibious landing would take place at Anzio, north of the Gustav Line and just 30 miles south of Rome. The idea was to land a force behind the Germans, threatening their supply lines and forcing them to retreat from Cassino. It was a sound plan on paper. The operation was codenamed Shingle. On January the 22nd, 1944, the U.S. 6th Corps and British 1st Division landed at Anzio. Surprisingly, they achieved total surprise. The beaches were almost undefended. The road to Rome was open. A jeep patrol actually drove halfway to the capital without encountering enemy fire. But the commander of the operation, Major General John Lucas, was a cautious man. Haunted by the near disaster at Salerno, he decided to dig in and consolidate his beachhead rather than rushing inland. He wanted to land all his tanks and artillery before making a move. This hesitation was fatal to the plan's success. Kesselring, reacting with his characteristic speed, rushed reserves to the area. He ringed the Anzio beachhead with steel. Within days, the Allies were trapped in a small, flat coastal plain, completely surrounded by German artillery on the Alban Hills. Instead of a spear thrust into the German rear, Anzio became a self-sustaining prisoner of war camp. Every inch of the beachhead was under observation and artillery fire. There was no rear area. The nurses in the field hospitals were as much at risk as the infantry on the perimeter. The soldiers at Anzio dug deep into the sandy soil, creating a subterranean city to escape the constant shelling. Meanwhile, back at the Gustav Line, the pressure to break through to relieve Anzio became desperate. This led to the First Battle of Monte Cassino. The task fell to the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls. In late January and early February, they were ordered to attack the mountains behind the monastery. The terrain was horrific: steep cliffs, deep ravines, and mining so dense that the engineers had to clear paths by hand, inch by inch. The men of the 34th fought with superhuman endurance. They clawed their way up the slopes in freezing rain and snow. They ran out of food and water. They carried their ammunition in socks slung over their shoulders because the crates were too heavy. They fought for days without sleep, taking heavy casualties from German paratroopers, the elite Green Devils who were defending the heights. At one point, forward elements of the 34th were within a few hundred yards of the monastery walls, but they were too exhausted, too few, and too depleted to take the final objective. After weeks of slaughter, they were pulled off the line, shattered. The 34th Division had sustained thousands of casualties. They had performed a feat of arms that was nothing short of miraculous given the conditions, but the monastery still stood, and the Germans still held the line. The failure of the first attack led to a darker decision. The belief persisted that the Germans were using the abbey as an observation post. General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the newly arrived New Zealand Corps, which was next in line to attack, demanded the destruction of the monastery. On February the 15th, 1944, the heavy bombers came. Wave after wave of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells dropped hundreds of tons of high explosives on the ancient structure. The soldiers in the valley watched in awe and horror as the white walls crumbled, and the roof collapsed in a cloud of dust and smoke. When the smoke cleared, the monastery was a jagged pile of ruins. But the bombing proved to be a tragic tactical error. The Germans, who had largely respected the neutrality of the building itself, now felt no such obligation. They moved into the ruins. The broken walls and cellars made for an even better fortress than the intact building. The rubble provided perfect cover for machine gun nests and snipers. When the Allies attacked again, they found the defenses stronger than before. The bombing had turned a building into a citadel. The months of February and March saw the second and third battles of Monte Cassino. Troops from all over the British Commonwealth and the Allied world were thrown into the cauldron. The New Zealanders, the Indians of the 4th Indian Division, and the Gurkhas all took their turn. The Gurkhas, fierce warriors from Nepal, managed to capture a feature known as Hangman's Hill, a rocky outcrop just below the monastery. They held it for days, completely cut off, receiving supplies only by air-drop, surrounded by Germans. But they, too, could not break the final line. In the town of Cassino itself, below the mountain, the fighting resembled Stalingrad. The town had been reduced to rubble by artillery and bombing. Tanks could not move through the streets because of the debris. Snipers hid in the sewers and cellars. The New Zealanders fought house to house, room to room. It was a war of grenades and bayonets. The Hotel Continental, a German strongpoint in the town, became the scene of bitter fighting where men fought on different floors of the same building. By the end of March, the offensive had stalled again. The Allies were exhausted. The winter had taken its toll. The Anzio beachhead was still a stalemate. The road to Rome remained blocked. It was time to pause, to regroup, and to wait for the ground to dry. As spring arrived in 1944, the landscape of Italy began to soften. Wildflowers bloomed in the craters left by shells. The snow melted from the lower peaks. The Allies used this time to build up their strength for one massive, coordinated push. This was to be Operation Diadem. The plan was to use overwhelming force across the entire front to break the Gustav Line once and for all. General Clark and the British commander, General Alexander, secretly moved divisions to concentrate their power. A key element of this new plan involved the French Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Alphonse Juin. These troops included Moroccan Gaumirs, mountain warriors from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. They were specialized in traversing terrain that other soldiers considered impassable. The attack began on May the 11th, 1944. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, lighting up the night sky from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. The ground shook with a continuous roar. While the British and Polish troops attacked Cassino directly, and the Americans pushed up the coast, the French Corps did the impossible. They struck into the Orensai Mountains, a range of trackless, rugged peaks that the Germans had left lightly defended because they believed no army could move through them in force. The Gaumirs, moving with their mules and often on foot, scaled the cliffs and infiltrated through the German lines. They appeared in the German rear areas, creating panic and chaos. They bypassed the strongpoints and cut the supply lines. At the same time, the Polish Second Corps was given the honor of taking the monastery. These men had a burning hatred for the Germans. Their country had been occupied, their families deported. For them, this was a vendetta. They attacked up the slopes of Monte Cassino through fields of poppies that were soon stained with blood. The fighting was savage. The Germans, the elite 1st Parachute Division, fought to the death. But the pressure was too great. With the French breaking through in the mountains and the British breaking the line in the valley, the German position at Cassino became untenable. On the morning of May the 18th, a patrol of the 12th Podolian Uhlans, part of the Polish Corps, made their way to the summit. The ruins were silent. The Germans had slipped away during the night to avoid being encircled. The Polish soldiers climbed over the rubble and raised a makeshift Polish flag over the remains of the monastery. Later, a British bugler played "The Last Post." The battle for Monte Cassino was over. It had taken 4 assaults in 5 months. It had cost the Allies over 55,000 casualties and the Germans 20,000. With the Gustav Line shattered, the race was on. The forces at Anzio broke out of their beachhead. The Germans were in full retreat. The road to Rome was finally open. But even in this moment of victory, there was controversy. General Mark Clark, focused on the prestige of capturing the First Axis capital, turned his American forces toward Rome rather than cutting off the retreating German 10th Army as the British commander, Alexander, had intended. On June the 4th, 1944, American jeeps entered the Eternal City. The The Romans poured into the streets, throwing flowers and wine. It was a moment of jubilation. The long winter, the mud, the slaughter at the Rapido River and Cassino seemed, for a brief moment, to be in the past. Flashbulbs popped as General Clark posed for photos in front of the Colosseum. But the headlines of the capture of Rome lasted only 2 days. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. D-Day. The eyes of the world shifted to France. The Italian campaign became a forgotten front overnight. The men in Italy, the D-Day Dodgers as they sarcastically called themselves, borrowing a mocking term from a British politician, knew that their war was far from over. Rome was not the end. It was merely a milestone. To the north lay the rest of Italy, and more importantly, the northern Apennines. Kesselring had not been destroyed. He had managed to withdraw his army largely intact to the next major defensive belt, the Gothic Line. The summer of 1944 saw a rapid advance north from Rome. The Allies chased the Germans through the rolling hills of Tuscany. This was a different kind of war for a few weeks. The terrain was more open, the weather was warm. The soldiers passed through medieval towns like Siena and Arezzo. The wine was good, and the reception from the civilians was warm. But the Germans were fighting a skillful delaying action. They would hold a river line or a ridge for a day or two, force the Allies to deploy, blow the bridges, and then slip away under the cover of darkness. By August, the Allied army stood before the Gothic Line. This line ran from Pisa on the west coast to Rimini on the east coast, cutting across the high peaks of the northern Apennines. It was a formidable barrier of concrete bunkers, tank turrets mounted on steel pillboxes, minefields, and barbed wire, all integrated into the jagged mountains. The strategy for breaking the Gothic Line required another massive effort. The Eighth Army would attack on the Adriatic coast, trying to break through into the Po Valley, while the Fifth Army attacked through the central mountains towards Bologna. The attack began in late August. The initial assaults were successful. The Eighth Army broke through the outer defenses on the coast, and the Fifth Army, now including the U.S. 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, an African-American unit, and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force pushed deep into the mountains. The fighting in the Gothic Line in September and October 1944 was reminiscent of the First World War. It was a war of attrition. The weather turned again. The autumn rains returned, turning the mountain trails into slides of mud. The clouds descended, grounding the Allied Air Force. The artillery spotters could not see their targets. One of the most grueling sectors was around the Fuda Pass and the Giogo Pass. These were the gateways to Bologna. The American 88th and 85th Divisions were tasked with taking the peaks that guarded the Giogo Pass. Peaks like Monticelli and Mount Altuzzo. The slopes were so steep that men had to pull themselves up by grasping roots and rocks. The Germans rolled grenades down the hill. Supplies had to be carried up on the backs of mules and men. For days, the battle raged on the razor-edged ridges. It was a silent, lonely war in the mist. Small groups of men hunted each other in the chestnut forests. The artillery fire stripped the trees bare. When the Americans finally took the peaks, they found German bunkers that were masterpieces of engineering, blasted out of solid rock, with living quarters, electricity, and heating. But the occupants were dead or captured. By late October, the Fifth Army was within sight of Bologna. The soldiers could see the city towers in the distance on a clear day. They could see the flat expanse of the Po Valley, promising good tank country. But they were exhausted. They had been fighting continuously for months. The ammunition was running low. The replacements were not arriving fast enough. And the winter had arrived early. General Clark made the difficult decision to halt the offensive. The Allies dug in for another winter in the mountains. This was the winter line all over again, but colder, higher, and more miserable. The line froze in place just a few miles south of Bologna. The winter of 1944 into 1945 in the northern Apennines was a season of suspended animation, a frozen purgatory where time seemed to lose its meaning. For the soldiers dug into the foxholes along the Gothic line, the war ceased to be about strategy or movement and became a primal contest against the elements. The mountains, jagged and hostile, were buried under feet of snow. The wind howled through the passes with a ferocity that could strip the skin from a man's face. This was the winter of waiting. The High Command had diverted resources to France and Belgium, where the Battle of the Bulge was raging. The Italian theater was stripped of seasoned divisions and vital supplies. The artillery shells were rationed. The men on the line were told to hold, just hold. They lived in bunkers carved into the rock, reinforced with sandbags and timber logs, often burning empty ammunition crates or diesel-soaked dirt to stay warm. The cold was a physical weight. It stiffened the bolts of rifles and froze the oil in the engines of the tanks. Patrols were the only activity that broke the monotony. Clad in white bedsheets or makeshift snow capes, small groups of men would slide out into the no-man's land between the ridges. These were ghostly encounters in the mist. A sudden burst of submachine gun fire, the dull thud of a grenade muffled by the snow, a brief flurry of violence, and then silence would return. The psychological strain was different from the terror of the assault. It was the strain of watching. Watching the white slopes for a movement that wasn't the wind. Watching the icicles form on the edge of the dugout. Watching friends succumb to trench foot or frostbite, evacuated not by a bullet, but by the temperature. But even in this stillness, the composition of the Allied force was changing. New blood was arriving, specialized blood. In January 1945, a unique unit arrived in the sector controlled by the U.S. Fifth Army, the 10th Mountain Division. These men were not draftees pulled from city streets or farms. They were skiers, mountaineers, and outdoorsmen recruited specifically for this terrain. They had trained in the high altitudes of Camp Hale in Colorado. They wore different uniforms, parkas, and mountain boots, and they carried equipment the regular infantry had never seen, like weasels, small tracked amphibious vehicles that could skitter over the snow. Their arrival signaled the beginning of the end for the German positions on the high peaks. The Germans held a commanding series of ridges, specifically Mount Belvedere and the jagged spine known as Riva Ridge. From these heights, they could observe every move the Americans made on the main highways leading to Bologna. To break the stalemate, these eyes had to be blinded. The operation to take Riva Ridge in February 1945 remains one of the most daring feats of mountaineering in military history. The ridge was considered unclimbable by the Germans. The cliff face rose 1,500 feet, almost vertical in places. Because it was deemed impassable, it was lightly defended. The men of the 10th Mountain Division saw this not as an obstacle, but as a staircase. On the night of February the 18th, under the cover of darkness, the soldiers began the ascent. They did not use artillery to soften the target. Silence was their weapon. They climbed with ropes and pitons, burdened with weapons and ammunition, moving inch by inch up the icy rock face. Below them the valley slept. Above them the German sentries shivered in their bunkers, oblivious. When dawn broke, the Americans were on the summit. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The Germans, stunned to find an army appearing from the edge of a cliff, were swept from the ridge. With Riva Ridge secure, the flank of Mount Belvedere was exposed. The next night, the division attacked the mountain itself. It was a brutal fight. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, knowing the value of the peak. But the mountain troops held. They fought in the snow, using grenades and bayonets, pushing the Germans off the high ground. The capture of these peaks blinded the German artillery spotters. For the first time in months, the convoys on the valley floor could move without instantly drawing fire. As the snow began to melt in March and April, the roads turned from ice to mud, and then, finally, to dry dust. The spring had arrived. The winter of waiting was over. The Allied armies, rested and resupplied, were ready for the final act, Operation Grapeshot. The plan was a massive 1-2 punch. The British 8th Army, positioned on the Adriatic side in the flatlands of the Romagna, would strike first. Their objective was to cross the Senio River and break into the open plains leading to the Po River. The U.S. Fifth Army in the mountains south of Bologna would attack a few days later, bursting out of the Apennines and into the Po Valley. The goal was not just to push the Germans back, but to catch them in a giant pincer against the Po River before they could escape. The offensive opened on April 9, 1945. The Eighth Army's attack was preceded by a terrifying display of air power. Hundreds of heavy bombers carpet-bombed the German positions along the Senio River levees. The earth heaved and cracked. As the bombers departed, the artillery opened up, a rolling barrage of fire that crept forward ahead of the advancing infantry. The crossing of the Senio showcased the evolution of warfare over the long campaign. The British used Churchill crocodiles, heavy tanks fitted with flamethrowers towing armored trailers of fuel. These mechanical dragons rolled up to the floodbanks where the Germans were dug in and unleashed jets of liquid fire. The flame rolled over the earth, consuming bunkers and machine gun nests. Following the tanks, the infantry laid kapok bridges, light, buoyant walkways, across the water and rushed the far bank. The sky during these nights was illuminated by artificial moonlight. Searchlights banked off the low clouds reflected a diffuse, eerie glow over the battlefield, allowing the infantry to see their way forward while blinding the defenders looking into the light. The German lines, thinned by attrition and lack of supplies, began to buckle. They fought with desperation, paratroopers and panzer grenadiers holding on to farmhouses and canal banks, but the sheer weight of the Allied material advantage was crushing them. 5 days later, on April 14th, the Fifth Army launched its attack in the center. The 10th Mountain Division, along with the 1st Armored Division and the 85th Infantry Division, surged forward. The fighting in the last foothills was savage. The Germans knew that once the mountains were lost, the Po Valley offered little cover. They turned every village, every stone barn into a fortress. But the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The Americans, after 2 years of learning the hard lessons of mountain warfare, were now experts. They coordinated closely with fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts, which prowled the skies ahead of the tanks. These aircraft, armed with rockets and bombs, acted as flying artillery. If a German tank broke cover, it was destroyed from the air. If a strongpoint held up the infantry, the pilots were called in to smash it. On April 21, 1945, the prize that had eluded the Allies for so long finally fell. Troops of the Polish Second Corps, rushing from the east, and American troops from the south, entered Bologna almost simultaneously. The scenes in the city were of wild ecstasy. The citizens of Bologna, who had lived under occupation and the threat of Allied bombing, poured into the squares. Partisans, the Italian resistance fighters who had been waging a shadow war in the mountains, came down from the hills with red scarves and Sten guns, joining the Allied columns. The capture of Bologna marked the psychological end of the German defense, but the physical destruction of their army was happening on the plains to the north. The German retreat, initially orderly, disintegrated into a rout. The Allied armored columns, finally free of the restricting mountains, fanned out across the flat, fertile Po Valley. This was tank country. The Sherman tanks and British Cromwells raced along the roads, bypassing resistance, cutting off retreat routes. The Germans were fleeing toward the Po River, the last great natural barrier before the Alps. But the bridges over the Po had been destroyed by Allied air attacks months prior. The German army was trapped against the water. The scenes at the banks of the Po were apocalyptic. Thousands of German vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, jammed the roads leading to the ferry crossings. The Allied aircraft, ruling the skies with absolute impunity, descended on these columns like hawks. They strafed and bombed the stalled convoys until the roads were choked with burning wreckage. The smoke columns were visible for miles. Desperate German units tried to swim across the wide, swift river. They abandoned their heavy equipment. Tiger tanks, the fearsome beasts that had terrorized the Allies since Tunisia, were driven into the river or blown up by their own crews. Artillery pieces were spiked. The mighty Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe, was being reduced to a mass of walking infantry, stripped of its steel. The crossing of the Po by the Allies was a chaotic but jubilant affair. There was little organized resistance left. Soldiers paddled across in assault boats, found rafts, or used the debris left by the Germans. Once across, the pursuit turned into a sprint. The names of the cities fell like dominoes: Verona, Parma, Modena. In the cities of the north, the partisans rose up. In Milan, Turin, and Genoa, the workers occupied the factories to prevent the Germans from destroying them. Street fighting erupted between the resistance and the fascist Black Brigades. By the time the Allied vanguards arrived, many of these cities had already liberated themselves. The Germans were surrendering in droves, thousands of men marching into captivity, their hands on their heads, the war finally over in their eyes. It was during this chaotic collapse that the final chapter of Benito Mussolini was written. The dictator, fleeing north with his mistress and a convoy of die-hard fascists, was intercepted by partisans near Lake Como. On April the 28th, he was executed. His body was taken to Milan and displayed in Piazzale Loreto, the very square where fascists had executed partisans months earlier. It was a grisly, medieval end to the regime, a release of 20 years of pent-up rage. The news of his death rippled through the advancing armies, a confirmation that the fascist era was truly dead. But the military campaign had one final act. As the Allies pushed toward the Alps and the Austrian border, secret negotiations were taking place in Switzerland. General Karl Wolff, the SS commander in Italy, had been in contact with Allied intelligence, led by Alan Dulles. Operation Sunrise, as it was known, was a high-stakes diplomatic game to secure the surrender of the German forces in Italy before they could retreat into the Alpine Redoubt, a mythical fortress area where it was feared the Nazis would fight a guerrilla war for years. On April the 29th, representatives of the German command signed the instrument of surrender at the Royal Palace of Caserta, near Naples. The surrender was to take effect on May the 2nd, 1945 at 12 noon. The days leading up to May the 2nd were strange and disjointed. In some sectors, the fighting continued fiercely as isolated German units, cut off from communications, refused to give up. In others, unauthorized truces broke out. American tanks rolled past columns of armed German soldiers marching the other way, both sides ignoring each other, focused only on the end. When the clock struck 12 on May the 2nd, a profound silence descended over the Italian peninsula. From the toe of the boot to the granite peaks of the Dolomites, the guns stopped. The roar of the engines faded. The screaming of the artillery, which had been the background music of life for nearly 2 years, was replaced by the sounds of birds, of wind in the trees, and the voices of men speaking without shouting. For the soldiers of the 5th and 8th Armies, the end was anticlimactic. There were no grand parades immediately. There was just a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. Men sat on the running boards of their trucks or lay in the grass of the alpine meadows and slept. They were survivors. They had walked from the beaches of Salerno, through the mud of the winter line, over the carnage of Cassino, and across the peaks of the Apennines. The cost of the Italian campaign was staggering. The Allies suffered over 300,000 casualties. The Germans, around 400,000. The Italian civilian toll was horrific, with tens of thousands killed by bombing, artillery, and reprisals. The country was wrecked. Its infrastructure was gone, its cities were scarred, its people were starving. Yet, amidst the devastation, there was a sense of profound accomplishment. The D-Day Dodgers had tied down nearly 1 million German troops who could have been used to fight in France or Russia. They had fought in terrain that favored the defender more than perhaps any other theater of the war. They had proven that a multinational force, Americans, British, Canadians, French, Poles, New Zealanders, Indians, Brazilians, Greeks, and Italians could fight as one. As the sun set on May 2, 1945, the lights began to come on in the villages of the Po Valley. For the first time in 5 years, the blackout was lifted. Windows that had been shuttered and draped in heavy black cloth were thrown open. The warm yellow glow of electric lamps spilled out onto the cobblestones. To the soldiers watching from their bivouacs, those lights were more beautiful than any flare or tracer. They were the lights of peace, but the story of the aftermath is its own chapter. The war was over, but the peace was fragile. The devastation was absolute, and the task of rebuilding a nation from the rubble was just beginning. The soldiers who had fought their way up the boot would soon be going home, leaving behind the white crosses that dotted the hillsides, the physical markers of the price paid for the liberation of Europe's soft underbelly. In the weeks following the surrender, the Allied armies transitioned from a force of destruction to an army of occupation and administration. The logistics that had been used to feed and arm divisions were now turned to feeding a starving population. The Bailey bridges that had carried tanks were now carrying Red Cross trucks. The interaction between the soldiers and the civilians changed. During the fighting, it was transactional, a trade of cigarettes for eggs, a wave from a passing jeep. Now there was time. American GIs, flush with rations and chocolate, became the temporary heroes of every village square. They played baseball in the fields where battles had raged. They flirted with Italian signorinas. They tried to process what they had seen. For the men of the 10th Mountain Division, the end of the war brought a unique assignment. They were sent to the area around Lake Garda and the Yugoslav border. Here, a new tension was brewing. Marshal Tito's communist partisans from Yugoslavia were pushing into Italian territory, claiming land around Trieste. The first shadows of the Cold War were already lengthening across the continent. The Americans found themselves in standoffs at checkpoints, weapons loaded, facing men who had been allies just days before. It was a stark reminder that the end of one conflict often plants the seeds of the next. However, for the majority of the troops, the primary thought was points. The military had established a point system for discharge. Battles fought, medals won, time in service. It all added up to a score that determined when you went home. Men became obsessed with the math of their own freedom. I've got 85 points, I'm out next month. I'm short 10, looks like occupation duty for me. The repatriation process was slow. Italy's ports were ruined, so moving hundreds of thousands of men took time. While they waited, they toured the country they had fought through. They visited Rome, not as conquerors but as tourists. They stood in the Vatican, they walked through the ruins of Pompeii. They saw the Colosseum, which seemed remarkably intact compared to the modern ruins of Cassino. It was a surreal juxtaposition, ancient history and modern destruction standing side by side. One of the most poignant sights in the summer of 1945 was the return of the prisoners of war. Emaciated men, Italians who had been interned by the Germans after the armistice in 1943, and Allied soldiers who had been captured in North Africa or at Anzio, began to trickle back. They walked along the roads, wearing rags, their eyes hollow. The Allied soldiers set up aid stations, feeding them soup and bread, witnessing the true human cost of the totalitarian regimes they had defeated. The landscape itself began to heal. The craters in the fields were filled in by farmers anxious to plant the next harvest. The Bailey bridges were replaced by temporary wooden structures, and then eventually by stone and steel. The wreckage of the tanks and trucks was towed away to be scrapped, the steel melted down to build the new Italy. But the scars remained. The mountains around Cassino were so full of unexploded ordnance that they were fenced off for years. Even decades later, farmers plowing their fields would occasionally strike a rusted shell, a lethal echo of the war. The Italian campaign had been a crucible. It was often criticized by historians and strategists as a strategic dead end, a bloody cul-de-sac. They argued that the troops could have been better used in France, that the mountains were too formidable, that the campaign took too long. But to the men who fought there, these arguments were academic. They knew what they had achieved. They had fought the Wehrmacht's best divisions in the worst conditions imaginable, and they had won. They remembered the names that would never appear in high school history books. San Pietro, the Rapido River, the Liri Valley, Fuda Pass, Livorgnano. These were not just points on a map. They were the places where they had lost their youth and their friends. As the troopships finally pulled away from Naples and Livorno in late 1945 and 1946, heading west toward the Atlantic and home, the soldiers looked back at the receding coastline. The smoke was gone. The mountains were purple in the distance, peaceful and majestic. The boot of Italy, once a trap, was now free. The D-Day Dodgers were going home, carrying with them the silence of the snow, the smell of the mud, and the memory of the mountains that they had conquered, one peak at a time. The story of the war in Italy is a reminder that victory is rarely swift or clean. It is a slog. It is a game of endurance. It is a test of the human spirit against stone, steel, and weather. And in the end, it is the story of the individual soldier, shivering in a foxhole, who stands up when the order comes and takes one more step up the mountain. While the surrender at Caserta brought an end to the shooting war against the Wehrmacht, it did not bring an immediate end to the soldiering. For tens of thousands of Allied troops, the summer of 1945 was not a season of homecoming, but one of tense vigilance and grim housekeeping. The silence that had fallen over the Po Valley was deceptive. Beneath the surface of the peace, new fractures were already forming, and the wreckage of the old world had to be cleared away by hand. The first shadow of the future conflict fell over the city of Trieste, a jewel of a port on the Adriatic Sea near the border of Italy and Yugoslavia. Even as the celebrations were erupting in Rome and New York, the soldiers of the American 88th Infantry Division, the Blue Devils, were rushing east, their tanks kicking up dust on the coastal roads. They were racing not to catch retreating Germans, but to beat an ostensible ally. Marshal Josip Broz Tito, the communist partisan leader of Yugoslavia, coveted Trieste. His forces had liberated the city from the Germans and were intent on claiming it for the new Yugoslavia. When the New Zealanders and Americans arrived, they found the streets patrolled by partisans wearing red stars on their caps, armed with a mix of captured German weaponry and British-supplied submachine guns. The atmosphere was electric with hostility. For the American GIs, this was a bewildering turn of events. Days ago, they had been fighting fascism. Now, they stood at roadblocks facing men who had been fighting the same enemy. The 88th Division set up checkpoints along what would become known as the Morgan Line, a demarcation separating the Allied zone from the Yugoslav zone. It was a hair-trigger situation. American Sherman tanks parked nose-to-nose with Yugoslav T-34s. Machine guns were trained on intersections. The soldiers slept with their boots on and their rifles loaded. This standoff in the Julian Alps was the true birth of the Cold War, occurring months before the term would enter the geopolitical lexicon. The GIs manning the roadblocks didn't know the politics, they only knew the tension. They watched the hills for movement, just as they had done in the Apennines. Negotiators worked feverishly in the background, and eventually Tito's forces withdrew, but the experience left a chill in the air. It was a stark lesson for the young soldiers. The world was not simply going to snap back to the way it was in 1939. While the 88th held the line in the east, the rest of the army settled into the bizarre reality of occupation. Italy was a broken country. The economy had collapsed. The lira was practically worthless. In this vacuum, the American cigarette became the new gold standard. A single carton of Lucky Strikes could buy a camera, a violin, or a week's worth of fresh produce. A bar of soap was a luxury item. A pair of nylon stockings was a treasure. This economic disparity spawned a massive black market. In the pine forests of Tombolo near Pisa, a notorious lawless zone emerged. It was a shantytown built of stolen army tents and crates, inhabited by a mix of Italian criminals, displaced persons, and Allied deserters, American, British, and others, who had slipped away from their units to live off the grid. Tombelow was the Wild West of the occupation, a place where military police convoys only entered in force. It was a dark underbelly to the liberation, a place where hijacked jeeps were stripped for parts and stolen rations were fenced by the truckload. It took months for the military authorities to finally raid and dismantle these camps, rounding up the wayward soldiers who had decided that the outlaw life was preferable to the discipline of the barracks. For the vast majority of troops who remained at their posts, the duty was less dramatic but far more melancholy: the cleanup. The most immediate danger was the mines. Kesselring's engineers had sown the Italian peninsula with millions of them. Teller mines in the roads, mines, the dreaded bouncing betties, in the fields, and wooden mines that defied metal detectors in the mountain trails. The task of clearing these fields often fell to the surrendered German troops. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be used for hazardous work if it was related to the removal of dangers they themselves had created. It was a grim spectacle. German pioneer units, now prisoners, formed long lines, probing the earth with bayonets or long metal rods, inching forward across the very fields they had rigged months earlier. Allied engineers supervised, watching from a safe distance. Accidents were frequent. A dull boom would echo across a sunny meadow, a cloud of dust would rise, and the line of men would pause, a gap where a man had just stood, before continuing the slow march. It was a final, lethal accounting of the war's engineering. But there was a task even more somber than mine clearing: the work of the Graves Registration Service. During the heat of the battles in the winter of 1944 and 45, many bodies could not be retrieved. Men had fallen in deep ravines, in minefields, or on slopes so swept by fire that recovery was impossible. Snow had covered them. Now, as the spring thaw completed its work, the mountains gave up their dead. Small teams of American soldiers, often accompanied by local Italian guides who knew the goat paths, hiked back up to the Gothic line. They returned to Mount Belvedere, to the Giogo Pass, to the ruins of San Pietro. They searched the foxholes and the dugouts. It was gruesome, silent work. They looked for dog tags, for letters in rotting pockets, for anything that could identify the remains. They placed the bodies in mattress covers or canvas sacks and brought them down the mountains on mules, just as the supplies had gone up. These remains were gathered in temporary cemeteries that dotted the Italian countryside, vast fields of white wooden crosses and stars of David. Later, they would be consolidated into the permanent American cemeteries at Nettuno, near the Anzio beachhead, and outside Florence. The caretaking was meticulous. The army was obsessed with the dignity of its fallen. But for the men of the Graves registration units, the smell of the damp earth and the sight of the skeletal remains of men they might have trained with was a trauma that would follow them long after they returned to civilian jobs in banks or factories. In the valleys, the living were trying to find a way to coexist. The relationship between the GIs and the Italian civilians was complex. There was genuine gratitude, certainly. The Americans had brought freedom and food. The soup kitchens set up by the army saved thousands from starvation in that first post-war year. But there was also friction. The soldiers were young, bored, and wealthy compared to the destitute locals. They dated Italian women, leading to tensions with Italian men who felt emasculated by their defeat and poverty. Yet profound bonds were formed. Many soldiers, particularly those of Italian descent who spoke the language or a dialect of it, found family they had never known. They visited ancestral villages, bringing jeeploads of flour and sugar to aunts and cousins. Marriages took place by the thousands. The War Brides Act allowed these Italian women to eventually emigrate to the United States. These weddings were often hurried affairs, conducted by army chaplains in bombed-out churches, followed by receptions where canteen cups were filled with local wine. As 1945 turned into 1946, the main obsession of every soldier was the magic carpet, the operation to bring the troops home. The point system determined the order. High point men, those with Purple Hearts, Silver Stars, and years overseas, left first. The low point men watched them go with envy, resigned to another winter of guard duty. The ports of Naples and Livorno became staging areas for the exodus. The Liberty ships and Victory ships, which had brought tanks and ammunition, were now refitted with bunks stacked 5 high to carry men. The waiting was interminable. Soldiers sat on their duffel bags in vast staging camps, playing cards, reading tattered paperbacks, and endlessly rumored about shipping schedules. When the orders finally came, the loading was a chaotic stampede. Men marched up the gangplanks, weighted down with souvenirs: German helmets, Luger pistols, pieces of marble from Mussolini's villas, accordions, and bottles of wine. As the ships cast off, the mood was not always the raucous celebration depicted in newsreels. For many, there was a quiet, contemplative silence. They lined the rails and watched the Italian coast fade into the mist. They were leaving behind the graves of friends. They were leaving behind a country they had destroyed in order to save. The beauty of the Bay of Naples, with Vesuvius smoking gently in the background, was undeniable, but for these men, it would always be the backdrop of their hardest days. The voyage home across the Atlantic took weeks. The North Atlantic in winter was rough. Seasickness was rampant. The ships were overcrowded, smelling of diesel, sweat, and vomit. But as they neared the American coast, the atmosphere shifted. The first sight of the coastline, usually the Ambrose Light or the dim shape of Long Island, sent a charge of electricity through the ship. Entering New York Harbor was the moment. The soldiers crowded the decks, climbing onto the lifeboats and the rigging to get a view. When the Statue of Liberty appeared, she was gray and small in the distance, but she grew larger, a mute welcome. There were cheers, yes, but often there were tears. Men weeping openly, hardened veterans of the Rapido and the Po Valley breaking down at the sheer reality of survival. The fireboats sprayed arcs of water into the air. The bands on the pier played Sentimental Journey and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree. But the America they returned to was different from the one they had left, and different from the one they had imagined in their foxholes. They had changed, but the country had moved on too. The economy was booming. People were talking about the future, about cars and houses. They didn't want to hear about the mud of the Apennines. They knew about D-Day. They knew about Iwo Jima. But when a veteran of the Italian campaign tried to explain the geography of the winter line, or the mule trains, or the sheer vertical misery of the mountains, he often found glazed eyes. Italy, oh, the soft underbelly. I heard that was easy compared to France. This was the final bitterness of the campaign. The men of the 5th Army and the British 8th Army felt their war had been misunderstood. They were the D-Day Dodgers, a label that stung because it implied avoidance of combat, when in reality they had faced some of the most concentrated and skillful German resistance of the war in terrain that was a fortress by design. Reintegration was disjointed. The soldiers went to separation centers, Fort Dix, Camp Kilmer. They turned in their equipment. They received their final pay and their Ruputure duck lapel pin, the emblem of honorable discharge. They took the train home. The transition from sergeant or corporal to civilian was abrupt. One day you were commanding a squad of men with lethal weapons, responsible for their lives. The next day you were a clerk in a hardware store, and the boss was yelling at you for stacking the paint cans wrong. The adrenaline withdrawal was real. Men found themselves waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. They dove for cover when a car backfired. They couldn't stand the waste of food they saw at family dinners. They joined the 52-20 Club, the government provision that paid unemployed veterans $20 a week for 52 weeks. It gave them time to decompress, to drink beer in VFW halls with men who understood the shorthand of the war. But slowly, the greatest generation got to work. They used the GI Bill to go to college, flooding the universities. They bought houses in the new suburbs. They put the uniforms in mothballs in the attic. Yet Italy remained with them. It was in the way they walked, perhaps a little more carefully, testing the ground. It was in their aversion to camping or cold weather. It was in the sudden silence that would overtake them when it rained for days on end. Years passed. The scars on the Italian landscape began to heal. The olive groves were replanted. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was rebuilt, stone by stone, rising white and pristine on the mountain top, a replica of what had been lost. The trenches filled with soil and grass. The rusted barbed wire was swallowed by brambles. But the veterans returned. In the 1960s and 70s, and especially on the anniversaries, they went back. They brought their wives and children. They drove rental cars up the winding roads to the passes. They stood on the ridges and pointed. That was where the bunker was. That was where Sal got hit. That was where we spent Christmas in '44. They visited the cemeteries. The Florence American Cemetery, with its thousands of crosses aligned in geometric perfection along the Greve River, became a place of pilgrimage. They found the names of their buddies. They touched the cool marble. They saw that the grass was perfectly manicured, that the Italian gardeners tended the graves with a reverence that was touching. One of the most remarkable aspects of these returns was the reception from the Italians. The old men in the village squares, who had been young partisans or terrified civilians, recognized the Americans. They embraced them. They brought out wine. They remembered. Liberatori, they called them. There was a shared history there, a bond forged in the tragedy of their country's destruction and rebirth. The Italian campaign was unique in the Second World War. It was not a campaign of sweeping maneuvers across vast plains. It was a vertical war, a war of intimacy with the terrain. It was a war where a single mountain could consume a division. It was a war of mules and mountains, of rain and ruins. To the history books, it might be a secondary theater, a holding action. But to the men who fought it, it was the whole world. It was a test of endurance that defined the rest of their lives. They knew the truth of the soft underbelly. They knew it was a spine of granite. And they knew that they had climbed it, fought for it, and ultimately walked down the other side to peace. The story of the Italian campaign is the story of the grind. It is the story of the unspectacular, day-after-day heroism of the infantryman who keeps moving forward when every instinct screams to stop. It is a testament to the fact that even the highest mountains can be crossed, step by agonizing step. As the years fade and the last voices of that generation fall silent, the mountains remain. The Apennines still stand guard over the peninsula, silent witnesses to the struggle. The wind still blows through the Futa Pass. The Liri River still flows to the sea. And in the quiet of the cemeteries under the Italian sun, the men of the 5th and 8th Armies sleep, forever young, forever holding the line.